if your sense of self is not based on my memories, my emotions, my circumstances, but something more significant, and from a Christian perspective, that would be your position in Christ, that you've been His chosen child. But it's almost like we get in trouble when we see ourselves as chess pieces. You know, like my anxiety, that's a chess piece, and my spirituality is a chess piece, as opposed to seeing ourselves as the board that the chess pieces are on. And I know that sounds really kind of, that's just playing with words. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I've been smoking all day. And smoking and drinking, and that's just left me with, I know that from your background that was horrible. And I haven't been smoking and drinking all day. So, as odd as it sounds, it's helpful to see yourself the way God sees you. I mean, He does not see you as your anxiety or your thinking or your circumstances. He sees you as His beloved, as His child. And if you could see yourself, and even the way Paul talks about us being that Christ is in us, there's a way in which the Bible would teach that the sense of self is a kind of a container creating the image of God that holds all those things. And the reason that's sometimes helpful when you deal, it's almost like watching just slightly removed so that you don't have to be overwhelmed by everything that's taking place in your life. And it's really a biblical way of seeing self. You know, where you get your identity from. You're not your feelings, not your thoughts, not your memories. Because somebody who's got dementia still has an identity. I mean, they're still a person. We get our personhood because that's given to us by God, and we contain. So we contain the different things as opposed to we are those different things. And that's kind of helpful because most of you in this room are very bright, very creative. And that should be a good thing. But in the world of anxiety, in the world of obsessive compulsive behavior, the ability to, that makes your mind spin in ways that it's hard for it to rest. And so in that case, it's helpful to kind of see yourself as, wait a minute. And so if you're kind of aware of what we've talked about, the first night, I gave some definitions of anxiety that's about control, and that we want to live by our values, not by, not by our circumstances. And that does help you with, I think everything good comes on the other side of fear and struggle and sorrow and loss. And there's a point in almost every good endeavor where you go, I don't think I want to do this. I know you're incredibly disciplined and work out, like a wild man. The difference between you and me is like one set in, I would be going, what am I doing here? I could be eating pizza, but you have that same feeling. It's just that you push through that and go, wait a minute, I'm going to do this anyway. And that's because he has a value that says to be in shape is important. And so all of us do that sometimes. We live, a matter of fact, you can't ever do anything difficult where you're not, sometimes deciding, I'm going to live by my value, not by my circumstances. And so that was our first night. And if you remember, I suggested that you pick all the roles of your life and pick your values that go with those roles. Write your own obituary, write your own eulogy. Kind of think about how you want your life to have stood and the important people in your life. I really don't want my kids to sit around at my funeral and say, he was really obnoxious, or he exhausted us, or I never really figured out what he wanted from me. Those aren't Now, I think sometimes that's what I would say, but that's not what I wanted to say. And so to be purposeful. So that was the first night. The second night, if you remember, was the kind of that odd sense, and we've kind of been building to the idea of being present with the container of self instead of I'm anxious or I'm not anxious. We kind of talked about how your thoughts are, and just want to challenge that your thoughts aren't always right. That God built your brain to automatically respond and to complete the loop and tell the story. And so, I did a funeral. That is a Freudian slip. I did a wedding yesterday in Ocala, Florida, and my son was the best man in the wedding, and that's how I got asked to do this. And but almost no one there were Christians. I mean, there was. In one sense, it was kind of an honor. I mean, I got to talk about things that most of them don't believe, and kind of try to do it in a way that would intrigue them. I mean, they asked me to say a blessing before the wedding banquet after the wedding, and I said, well, my faith tradition, the next chapter begins, or this chapter ends at a big wedding banquet, and God would say this is a foreshadowing of the real banquet that will take place, and so it was kind of interesting, but I knew that most of these guys knew Pierce from being in a band, a ska band, from high school for about 10 years. They just played, and they know that Pierce quit the band because of faith, and they know that I was probably the reason that I pushed him to kind of quit the band. And so none of them, I mean, I'm not like their favorite. Yugoslavia, that was the name of the band, does not like me a lot.
Swedish metal, or what kind of music is that?
It was ska, which is, which it's okay that you don't know what that is. That's probably a sign that you have good taste. In the 90s, there was an odd combination of punk, reggae, and jazz.
Wow,
that lasted for about, a year. That lasted about, a couple of years, called ska, and so they have trumpets, but it's got a real staccato sort of music. Anyway, there's a reason you never heard of ska music, but so I came up yesterday. I drove to Ocala to do the wedding, and as I come up, two of the guys that were in the band that I haven't seen, in 6 or 7 years, they start talking as I came up. Now, I immediately close the loop. Wow, they don't like me. They know I'm here. They wish I wasn't here. Do you ever do that? Do you ever just close the loop on something that you don't really have much data on at all? Well, the truth is, they were just talking. And they probably could care less that I was there. I mean, they haven't seen me in 7 or 8 years. They didn't care that I was walking out, but my mind closed the loop, and that's how our minds work. And so that second week, we kind of deconstructed the reality that your thoughts aren't always right, and you are not your thoughts. And that if there was just one thing that would help you with anxiety the most, with the exception of what we're going to talk about tonight, I would say it would be that. Because if you're obsessive compulsive, if you're perfectionistic, if you're anxious, it's helpful to know that that you're being bullied, and your thoughts aren't always right. I mean, it's helpful to be able to go there. And what I suggested that you do with your thoughts is treat them like you would a bully, with playful irreverence. And so that was second week. Third week was your emotions. And most of us believe our thoughts, and we try to cut out our emotions. Um, and I was going to say, no, I think what you want to do is accept your emotions and go through them as instead of trying to avoid them and then them kind of pushing their way in. Emotions have a way of bubbling to the surface if you don't acknowledge them. They just do. I mean, so if you're, I mean, and they bubble up physically if they don't, if no other way. There's even a whole list of conversion disorders in psychiatry and psychology that talks about how psychological things are manifest physically. A lot of our backaches, a lot of our headaches, a lot of our stomach aches. Those are often, if you kind of pull on that string long enough, they're more common when you're anxious. They're more common when you're, and so our emotions have a way of bubbling to the surface, even when we try to kill them. And so the idea was to experience and go through your emotions as opposed to trying to minimize or push them away, and that somehow they lose some of their power when you go through them as opposed to trying to push them away. Now, I need to you were in my Sunday school class this morning. Anybody else? Because I'm use something today for today's class that fit the class this morning, but it also fits what we're going to talk about tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about living and being present. Living in the present. But before we do, I want to say that a lot of times we start refusing to experience boredom, so we pick up our phone all the time. We refuse to experience tension, and so we eat, or I eat. We tend to, sometimes we'll just numb out and look on video on the internet. Have you ever just found yourself on just I know that the younger people in here don't do this anymore, but Facebook, that my age still has. Have you ever found yourself like you start on Facebook and you find yourself in some labyrinth of mystery that how did I get here, and what am I looking at, and why, and not that it's dirty or wrong, it's just it's a waste of your time, but it sure beat feeling. And a lot of times the reason I don't live in the present is because the present might not be pleasant, and I can always imagine a better future. And so I sometimes don't live in the present. And the idea of not cutting off your emotions and living in the present, just I've got a kind of a pretty dramatic example of the danger of that. And it comes out of my life. We know how Skylar will probably die. Skylar does not feel internal pain. Did I use this example last week, right? Okay. And that cutting off your emotions or choosing to not live in the present is like that. And by doing that, you're missing out on the data you need to live life. And so with that, let's talk about living in the present. Jesus is either really bad with grammar, or he was very intentional when he said things like, before Moses was, I am. That's either really bad grammar. Most theologians would say he's using the term in the Old Testament for God, that I am. But it's also a verb shift from, that's talking about his presence. And so it's this is a little bit of theology kind of, um, you know, you don't have to agree with what I'm going to say. Don't split the church over it. The Bible seems to teach that God doesn't live in our time system. The Bible seems to teach that to God, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is to a day. What does that even mean? St. Augustine, in the end of his spiritual biography, spends the last part of he kind of concludes it because he thinks it's one of the most important things for you to realize is that God is always present. God lives in the present. And Isaac Newton found out that if you move the speed of light, time stands still. And so you've seen, if you've seen any of science fiction shows, they'll talk about, somebody will age at a different speed because of the speed they're moving in relation to the set point. And so, right, have you seen shows like that? That's based on Isaac Einstein's theory of relativity in time, which suggests that if you move in the speed of light, time is relative and it changes. Well, if God is always moving and always present and omniscient, then there is a way in which he's always present. Now, I don't understand that. And I think to understand that, you need like 50 IQ points more than I got. But the Bible does seem to teach that there's a presence, that God is present in his creation. I've got some good friends that are kind of from the charismatic world, and I love going to their churches, but one of the funny things they often do is they invite God to be present. They'll say, God, we invite you in. And I go, God is always present. You might not be attuned to him. You may not be aware of him, but he owns it. He is present. And so the idea of presence is really a theological concept, not just a psychological concept. Healthy people tend to live in the present. We're going to try just a silly little exercise for a second. Let me pull out my phone so I can measure a minute. I'm going to get you just to be very present. First of all, if you had to just measure your anxiety level right now between 1 and 10, what would it be? I mean, right now, sitting in the room, 4, 3, 2. I mean, like you all, it must be probably a little higher. Your child's out. I mean, you might be thinking about, work next week, or so. If you had to put a number on it, 1 to 10, 10 being I'm really pretty anxious right now, 1 being I'm chilling. Where would you be? Everybody just.
Be a 3.
3? 6?
5 or 6.
5.
Probably like a 1.
Oh, 1.
3 or 4.
Okay, good. So, so what we're going to do is I'm going to try to get you just to live in the present for just a minute. And so, if you want to, you can close your eyes. You don't have to. But I want you just to stop for just a second. And let me start my little timer. And I want you to think about your left foot. As a matter of fact, take your left foot and just place it on the ground. And just think about your left foot and the sole of your left foot. Can you feel it against your shoe? Can you move your toes And feel the way that the muscle touches and kind of moves back through the rest of your foot. Stop for a second. Focus on your left sole of your foot. Can you feel the blood pulsating in? Can you sense that? And now push your foot against the ground. Feel how that pressure kind of even comes up your leg a little bit. Now release it. Push it again. And release it. Just focus on your left foot. Now if something else comes to mind, like, boy, this is silly, or some other thought, just kind of gently push that aside and go back to attending to your left foot. Just for a minute. Just for a minute. Now the front part, that kind of pad on your, that kind of pad on the front of the bottom of your foot. Kind of now push out to that and let you kind of feel your toes. Now pull back and now push against your heel. And feel that. Now, you can stop. We could go to your right foot. We could go to... chances are, if we did this in a big enough room, and I'd not set it up ahead of time, and I said your stress level or anxiety level before that and after that, it would have gone down just a little bit. Even though we didn't deal with anything you're anxious about, money, life, career, children, we didn't deal with any of those things, but why would you feel less anxious? Because you moved into the present. And the present, it's hard to be anxious. Most of us, instead of living in the here and now, live in the there and then. If you live in the past, you have a lot of shame and guilt. And if you live in the future, you have a lot of anxiety. Anxiety is a future-based thing. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, don't worry about what, again, future tense. Instead, consider the flower. Study the birds. Outside where there are birds, and he's talking in a way that gets the people to, don't be anxious. Instead, live in the present. Live in the present. There is a lot of, it's incredibly helpful. It's very spiritually hygienic to be contemplative sometimes and live in the present. Most of the time, I am in problem-solving mode. And problem-solving mode is learning from the past, reflecting on the past, and thinking about the future and planning. And you got to do that some. As a matter of fact, you're going to be in problem-solving mode more than any other kind of mode. However, some of us never leave problem-solving mode. We spend our whole life in that kind of place, and therefore we don't live in the present. We don't live in we don't live aware and feeling what is going on in our present. I didn't go to a Christian home, so this example, I don't mean, I think the reason that I, in college, started curbing my drinking, first of all, I saw the potential for addiction, because I'm kind of highly impulsive and highly compulsive, and those personality types tend to not. But I also started realizing I wasn't present in important moments. And I remember going out on a date, and and I wasn't present. And I remember thinking, I don't want to not be present in life, even if it's not good things. And I started, and again, this is in college. I'm not a Christian, so don't, I'm just saying this. Don't get mad at a pig for eating slop. That's what pigs do. But I remember starting to go to some parties and not drinking and watching the people around me and thinking, they're not even aware. They're missing the game or each other, and I just thought, I'm missing stuff because I'm not present. And so even as a pagan, even as a non-Christian person, there was something in me that said, I think there ought to be some time of my life that I'm more contemplative and present than just spinning. And even more so as I read the Bible and hear, Jesus say things like, his promise to me is not that he'll change my circumstances. His promise to me is he will be with me. He will be present with me, even to the ends of the earth. As you know, I'm a psychologist, counselor, and I know the church just raised money to build these offices. But let me tell you, here's what counselors really do. What you're paying for is for somebody to be present with you. Because people come in, they want me to change their circumstances and change their feelings. I can't do either one. I have no ability to change somebody's feelings. I have no ability to change somebody's circumstances. And so what do I offer? Well, very poorly, I offer what Jesus offers. But very poorly, I offer being present and listening and attuning and resonating. And those things have a way of sticking with a person and forcing them to live in the present and feel what they're feeling and face what they're facing, and then they begin to possibly get better. But what I'm really selling is presence, and that's why before people come into my office, I sometimes will drink this little. I'm very mindful of the fact that all I can offer here is God's. If I'm supposed to be, Christ's representative in this room, I've got to be present with them. And so I've got to pay attention to the look in their eyes. I've got to pay attention to the inflex in their voices, because being present is really a gift. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most generous things you can give someone, is your presence. And so often, I don't do that with the people I love the most. I mean, how many times Mona said, I told you that yesterday. I was like, wait, did you really? Oh, when did you tell me that? And she did, but I was on my phone, or I just wasn't there when I was there. One of my values as a father and as a husband, when I was kind of thinking about it, one of them was going to be that I was there when I was there, because I ended up just going with I was fun as a father, but there's the idea of being present. Does it make sense?
Jim, what do you mean by contemplative?
Contemplative is now. Please don't contemplate your foot, but when the Bible says to be still and know that He is God, that is an invitation to be contemplative. It's an invitation not to plan about what God might do next, or not to remember, but it's to contemplate the goodness of God, contemplate being present with Him. And it's not worry at all. It doesn't look like worry. It looks like being. Remember when you first started dating someone and you were just so into them? I'm just aware how seldom sometimes Mona and I just look at each other's eyes anymore. But when you first dated, remember that was, I mean, it's like, you'd sit there and it'd be like, because you were just being present with them and enjoying them, and that's contemplative. I miss so much of my life because I'm not present. Every day there's a sunrise and a sunset, and most of them are beautiful, and I notice very few of them. We live within an hour drive of one of the wonders of the world in terms of the Smoky Mountain, the fauna, and it is one of the most diverse places on earth when it comes to botany and I didn't even go up there this fall to look at the changing things. We lived an hour away from the ocean and in Orlando, and after you'd been there a while, how many times did I not? I mean, how many? When you first get down there, it's like, gosh, we're gonna go to the ocean every weekend, and then after a couple of months, it's like, the sand. I hate to go over there. You get sand in your car. I hate to clean up the sand, and I think how many. I think when I get to heaven, I think one of my greatest. I don't know if we'll have regret in heaven. I think we'll be just so delighted that we're in His presence, but. I think the sense of how much I missed, how much was available for me to see, how much glory, how much beauty, the people, even the Bible says that there are times in your life where you've entertained an angel without knowing it. How cool is that? I mean, how cool is that? Evidently I'm not being disrespectful the way I'm talking about heaven and angels, but evidently there's a squad of angels up there that their job is to kind of go hang out with us at different times and just to represent God in a whimsical way with us. I mean, what a cool assignment that must be in heaven. Who gets to be on that squad? But I'm 64 years old, 65 years old. I would guess that there's been a few times in my life where I've entertained angels. But I don't think I was present enough to know. I think when we get to heaven, we're going to find out that there were angels all over the place and that God was moving and stuff, and He put, that there were special times when there were shooting stars and things that were just beautiful that just went by that we didn't notice. And I don't say that so you'll feel guilty. I just say that because we live separated from present. And you can't be contemplative all the time, and you can't even be present all the time. But most of us aren't present much at all, and we're not that contemplative. I mean, I've given the example. I left Ocala. The wedding was over at 6:30. So I get in the car in Ocala and start driving here. So I get in about 3:30 last night, and so for sometime around then. And at one point, I got really tired, and I quit being. And I had to stop. I had to stop and just stop because I wasn't being present. I was, I looked inside and said, "No, where am I in Georgia?" Which, by the way, if you struggle with not believing there's a hell, you should just drive between Macon and Valdosta, Georgia, over and over again. Just turn at Valdosta and then drive back to Macon, and then turn at Macon and then drive back to Valdosta, and do that over and over again. And maybe do it when it's raining late at night. And I just want to tell you, by the time you get to Macon, you'll go, I think there is eternal punishment, and I think I have a picture of what that might look like. Being present, how much we've missed. So let me look at this clever, how you've been so impressed with how organized I always am. I know that. Just a second, it's right here. Week 4 is right here, my notes on week 4. I know you didn't believe me, but that's what it is. The prayer for the beginning of week 4, and I know we're not beginning week 4, we're almost 3/4 of the way through it, but I did have a prayer for tonight by Thomas Keating, and it says this: welcome, welcome, welcome. I welcome everything that comes to me today because I know that it is for my healing. I welcome all thoughts and feelings, emotions, persons, situations, and conditions. I let go of my desire and my need for power and for control. I let go of my desire for affection, esteem, approval, and pleasure. I let go of my desire for survival and security. I let go of my desire to change any situation, condition, and person or myself. I commit to living in the present with my God. I open to the love and presence of God and God's action within me. Amen. And it's just I'm going to show you a kind of a prayer in a minute that was kind of used by some of the early desert fathers, and that's not really a part of my tradition, but I do like how passionate these guys were about their faith, and I know it's not kind of a very Presbyterian to talk about, some of those old desert fathers that went out, and they were some of the first theologians in Christian, because early Christianity was a slave religion that didn't have a lot of theology, it just had story. And then it had the Gospels, and so the first theologians were what some people now call kind of the desert fathers, that kind of went out and tried to put together how these ideas work. And some of their ideas are still pretty profound, but so some of these prayers kind of come out of that. Anxiety is future tripping. We all have been with people who aren't present with us, right? I mean, the lights are on and nobody's home, and you want to. Have you ever been with somebody and if you ever just somebody says, "How you doing?" and you know they're not even going to listen to you, and you want to say something like, "Horrible, I'm just about to die," and just see if they go, "Well, great, good talking to you." You've ever had one of those moments where somebody's just kind of just going through the motions, and somehow that's not how I want to. That's a killer of relationships. If you want to read somebody, he's not Christian, he's brilliant. He's a neuropsychologist named Dan Siegel, and Dan Siegel's written a lot about. You can even go online and see he has a thing called an awareness wheel, where he's talking about presence. His latest book is called Aware, and he's talking about the importance. He would say this. I don't know if he'd use this phrase, but how psychologically hygienic it is to be able to live in the present. Here's what he says: where attention goes, neural firings flow, and then neural connections grow, and ultimately your brain grows. Neuroplasticity is the reality that your brain is still changing and growing, but that only happens when you're attuned into the present. Um, Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. To give somebody your, I mean, one of the most scandalous things Christians believe. It's not the resurrection. One of the most scandalous things Christians believe is that God listens to you in your prayers. I mean, who am I that God would listen to me and everybody else is praying? C.S. Lewis tried to explain it in Mere Christianity, how God could hear everybody at the same time that's praying, and how that is, and that's that idea that he's always present. But it's scandalous to believe that. But it's the most beautiful form of generosity is the idea that you'll give somebody their attention.
Don't you think that is that kind of how, I sort of feel like that's how Satan uses anxiety against us. Like, I mean, I know we're all born, with certain levels of anxiety. There's caution that comes from that. But it's like those, I don't know, I think sometimes those repetitive thoughts are a way that the devil kind of gets at us.
I couldn't have said that any better. I think you're meaning, and it just takes you away from that presence.
And in that then comes that guilt, and then I'm sinning, because I'm not supposed to be anxious, and I don't know. I think there's something very interesting in that.
Like, how could I have this sin again if I really am a Christian? I must not really be a Christian.
Right.
Have I committed the unforgivable sin? And then all of a sudden we're off to the races, and Satan is just laughing because we're not, at that point, we're not present with God. We're present with our reoccurring thoughts.
It helped me a lot with anxiety when I put that perspective on it. Like whenever, because I, just was feeling so bad about why do I have the thoughts then? Why can't I try? And that helped me a lot.
I think it's good. That great Christian philosopher, Qui-Gon Jinn from Star Wars Episode 1. He was a great theologian. He said, always remember your focus determines your reality. Must be true if it was in Star Wars. So they've done a lot of, if you were to say, what's one of the most important thing that has to take place for a good marriage or for a good relationship? What needs to be there? What's one of the most important things that needs to be there in the basis for a relationship? Communication, you're right. What else? Trust. As a matter of fact, trust may be one of the pillars that relationships live on. Now, this is not biblical, but just because some social scientists did the research doesn't mean, and they came up with this, doesn't mean we don't need to learn. We can't learn from it. But they were studying what makes good relationships, and they came up with trust being one of the pillars of relationships. Well, how often are we told trust God? Well, they started looking at what creates trust, and this is really fascinating. They came up with an acronym called PART, P-A-R-T, and they said that trust doesn't just happen. Trust is a result. It's the end of a pattern, and the first thing is presence. If you're present with someone, the second thing is attunement. You can't attune unless you're present. And attunement, just think of the word to tune a guitar is to take the string and listen well enough to where I'm at the same pitch of the other. So you attune. Well, if I'm present with you and then I attune to you, that's another fancy way of just saying I have empathy for you. I don't feel what you feel, but I I'm listening, I'm attuned to you, then I'll resonate with you. Well, I could see how, boy, I could see how that would make you angry. Boy, I could see how that would really bother you. And that's what builds trust. Presence, attunement, resonance, to resonate with, trust. And sometimes when we say, how do I trust God? Well, you've got to be present with him. You attune to him. You then resonate with his will, not your own. And that's when he says, ask anything in my will and I will do for you. That's the idea, is that if you're following that, you can trust him. But that's what you need to do, build your relationships. But many of us don't even make the first step. We don't make the P of part. We don't do the presence. And then we go, what's wrong with our relationships? Well, we never are present, attuned, resonating, and then therefore trust can't grow. And again, that's not, don't split a church over it. Don't start the part movement. It's just helpful research that doesn't contradict what we know Scripture to teach, and therefore it's kind of helpful to go, that's really helpful.
I think a lot of people have that attunement piece too, that they're missing the presence, and I think that's where that attunement can go off the rails for you. Like you think you're so attuned, and that's why you go home and you worry so much about like, what are they thinking? How did they do that? Like, did I do that right? But really, maybe if you'd been truly present, that wouldn't have gotten a hold of you that way.
That's true. That attunement would be attuned to them, not to your anxiety.
Right. Yeah, because I feel like that lots of people think that, I know so many people that they leave something and they are playing that back in their mind. And I mean, I'm guilty of it too. You leave something and you're just thinking, what did I do? Did I say that right? Did I do that? Did they really think it that way? But I'm like, maybe if I've been truly present.
If the reason I did this class is I felt like it was irresponsible to talk about anxiety from 10,000 feet above sea level. And then I felt like the church needed to do some next steps. But what I think the next step would be a place to have conversations that would not be lecture driven, but driven by some of the things, some of the comments, here's what I experienced, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm doing, because we don't just need information, we need relationship and connection, and since we only had 4 weeks to talk about all this anxiety stuff, basically I gave you information, but I almost wish you could have seen the room when you spoke. People's shoulders dropped. It's like, oh, somebody else experienced that, and I'm, and there's something about that attunement that is very life-giving. In Sunday school class today, that guy who said that he, there was attunement between the two of you, and the room felt different. It was like, oh, this isn't just a regular prayer request. People are attuned to one another, and there's something about that feels very, loving. And maybe if out of the 3 groups there might be somebody that would want to try to do one group that would be a little more about, a little less about information and a little more about engagement of it. But be aware that where you put attention brings awareness, and with awareness you can have intentionality. So I'll give you an example. Has anybody here recently bought a different car, or is driving a new car, a car they've not driven before? Okay, I'm gonna ask that question again. If everybody would just raise your hand, and then I'll use the example. Did anybody here recently buy a new car? Oh, all of you. Well, we bought a Mazda CX-5 now a couple years ago, but Mazda's not that big of a brand, and I didn't see many Mazdas out on the road. But we bought this red Mazda, and all of a sudden, there are red Mazda CX-5s everywhere. I was like, where are they? Now, you probably haven't been seeing them, but has that ever happened to you where there's something that you don't pay attention to, but as soon as you started to give it your attention, all of a sudden, there's an awareness. Well, that's true in our lives, and one of the reasons I think God wants us to slow down and be present is that when we do that, we'll notice it. And after we notice it, we can be intentional about it instead of reactive. You know, remember from the very beginning, I've said there's a space between our sensation and perception that we're trying to create so that we're not merely reactors that do things that we don't know why we do. But we're trying to put space in there so that we behave based on what God would want us to become and what we're becoming instead of what we were kind of programmed or what Satan is wanting us to be. And so that happens when I give my attention, my awareness to something that gives me, you know, so when I am present and I notice, and then that gives me awareness, and that awareness allows me to be intentional with my decisions. And so all of this has been about the idea of presence. So what could you do this week if you wanted to just kind of think about being present? Slow down. Try to remember that what the old Christian leaders used to call live in a sacred rhythm of listen, rest, and pray. You're not going to do it all the time, but even in our tradition in these generations, we call time with God our quiet time. Rarely is it quiet, and the truth is sometimes my devotional life seems more like a checklist that I'm focused on. Well, this will go well in a sermon someday, or this might help in a class I'm teaching, instead of really being present with God and being attuned to that. You know, one of the dangers of people who worship and who lead worship is that the worship becomes more. They're not present in their worship because it's a task they're doing, and it's like, oh, I'm supposed to lead worship, and so they're not worshiping. Do you know what I mean? I have a bunch of little silly examples of kind of, you know, this week, try to be mindful in eating. You know, just slow down and try to taste the food of something. You know, I just scarf so much food down that without really even tasting it. The last thing, another way to just practice presence is there's an old prayer that's kind of been around a long time called the examine prayer, and it's just a prayer to pray at the end of the day. Some people do it at the beginning of the day. That kind of focuses on being present with God. It starts with recalling the day. So you begin with, I'm going to give you a copy of a little kind of a how-to of this type of prayer. God is present, but always not apparent. We are often not quiet and alert enough to be aware of His presence. So begin by saying, Lord, here's my day. This is what happened today. And then ask the question, what are you saying to me about my day? What was I supposed to learn today? If we believe in a sovereign God, then he was active and present today, and even if I wasn't. So what were you trying to say to me today? So pause, breathe, do that Jesus prayer a couple of times, and then first recall the day. What happened today? Walking, working, people, places, tasks, appointments. What were your emotions throughout the day? I felt bored, relief, resentment, compassion, anger. When was I most alive? When was I most fulfilled today? When was I most taxed or stressed or distracted or depleted? So that's recalling the day. Then rejoice in God's presence and goodness. Where have I noticed God's presence in any of this? When did I feel closest to God today? What gifts of God could be grateful for today? When did I receive and give love today? And what's really sad is I've been trying to do this. I'm teaching 3 of these classes, and so they started at different times. And so it's been like this morning, I wasn't sure if, I wasn't sure, are we meeting tonight? Have I already done this? But I found this prayer that I'm going to give you all, this prayer of examine. And so I've been trying to kind of do this a little bit. And I never think about, what did I notice God's movement today? If he was present with me all day, shouldn't I notice that? Well, what would I do if I stopped and noticed that? When did I feel closest to God today? What gifts of God can I be grateful for today? When did I receive and give love? And then, if you're like me, since out of a whole 24-hour period, I may only be able to recall 10 minutes of presence with God, there's a place to repent. Where do I see my sinful patterns and attitudes? Where have I been critical and loving thoughts today? What part of my life was still untouched by a God who was present, but I was not attuned to? And then you finish with a renew, commitment to follow Jesus tomorrow. What does all this I've just reflected on show me about myself and about God? Ask the Spirit to direct you to something during the day where he thinks is particularly important. Pray about in your heart. Look toward tomorrow. What feelings surface as you consider them coming up? Are you doubtful, hopeful, apprehensive, full of anticipation? Ask the Spirit for his presence and guidance. Thank the Holy Spirit for his presence and guidance. And that's the end of the prayer. So I'm going to give you guys a copy of that. And it's not exactly, you'll see. Now, I think I think I was supposed to kind of tear all these pages apart. And I'll tell you what, if you'll just take the first 2 pages, and then you're just going to fold them, and it makes kind of a book. But I think I was supposed to, take them all apart and staple them, and so you'll just take those first 2 pages, and you've got a prayer. And then, if you'll pass these around from that side. Because I didn't want to be the only person with a real messy bunch of papers, so I thought I'd just give you a bunch of papers. Those are coming around, there's 2 more going that way. I think there'll be enough. Here. It's going to be a race. I think you're going to get yours from that side.
Okay.
So, two things. One is a willingness and action plan. What I've done is, if you're like me, there's 1,000 things I'd like to change about my life. Maybe 1,000,000. And I didn't want you just to leave frustrated. So this is something that I've used with people before. It's, written by somebody I got. But it's based on some of the things we've done. So is there something is there a goal? Be specific. And here's the important part. What are the values underlying that goal? What actions will I take to achieve that goal? And then this is the part about being present. And this is the part about your thoughts and your feelings. The thoughts, memories, feelings, sensation, urges that I'm willing to make room for in order to achieve this goal. I mean, for me, if my goal was to lose 10 pounds, I'd need to be willing to be hungry. I would need to be willing to feel hunger. I would have to be willing to feel bored so often, when you work with addicts, you say, halt, don't be aware when you're hungry, angry, halt, HAL, lonely or tired. And what you tell people that are struggling with addiction is be aware when you're one of those 4 things, because you are more susceptible at that moment to act out on your addiction. Because and so am I willing to be hungry? I'm willing to be angry and not try to not act out on that. Am I willing to be uncomfortable? I love the theologian that said, it's not the good people. A lot of times people that are really, the people that are really wild kind of make fun of the people that are really goody two-shoes. And they say things like, well, you don't understand. No, that's not true. The person who resists temptation understands the difficulty much more than the person that gives in to temptation. And so there is a way in which, because they have gone through the tension, they've gone through that struggle of not. So what thoughts and memories, what feelings, what sensations, what urges are you willing to live with in order to make room for that goal? I think sometimes the reason we don't meet our goals is we don't acknowledge the price that we're going to have to pay. Because there's a reason we do what we do, and a lot of the bad habits we have, the reason we do them is that there is a secondary gain we get from it. I get a secondary gain from wasting time. I get a secondary gain from, from eating pizza at 3 in the morning. It would be useful to remind myself what am I going to need to remind myself during the journey of changing the behavior? If necessary, I can break this goal down into smaller steps. A lot of times, one of the reasons that we don't accomplish a change is that we have this long-term abstract goal, like I want to be in better shape. And a long-term abstract goal will always be trumped by a short-term concrete goal. And so, how can I break that down? The smallest, easiest step I can begin with, and essentially what commitment am I willing to make? There's a book out called Atomic Habits. It's an okay book. It's a secular book on how do we change. It's amazing. Psychology asks great questions. They just don't have good answers. And the Bible, we Christians, we have great answers. We just don't ask good questions. But so this guy's been writing a book of how we change, and his theory is small. You just break something down into, this big activity into like 100 things, and you just do the next small thing. And so, like, if my goal is to exercise every morning, the first thing I would need to do is, if I'm going to exercise every morning, I'm going to have to, put on, gym clothes when I get up. And so he says, for a week, don't go work out. just do the smallest thing first. Just put on a pair of gym socks when you get up. Well, if I'm going to work out before I get up, I'm going to have to get up, 15 minutes earlier. Well, get up 15 minutes early. Don't go to the gym yet. Just get up 15 minutes early, put on those socks, and just sit there. And develop what he's kind of saying is atomic habits. What he's saying basically is do the next small thing, and then once you kind of get that in your habit, do the next small thing, and the next small thing. Before long, you've developed a habit. So that's anyway. So this uses the material that we talked about in this class to kind of on a real practical basis. So that's something for you to have from tonight. And the other is this prayer. And I don't like staged prayers. But in this case, it might be just a good thing to look at. So does anybody have any thoughts or comments about anything, how you're doing? If any of this has helped you with your anxiety or